Now that we're on the file list and file reader chapter, I want to introduce the concept of a file reader. This is a nice API that lets us read information about a particular file. Now in this, what we're going to do is take our image and then read the data of the file as a data URI. What this allows us to do is then set a new image source so we can essentially preview the image in the browser. Now our files to upload, what we're going to simply do, now that this is an array, is we can say files to upload and then pass in a nice for each. We're then going to show the file preview. So in a moment, we're going to create a nice function that's going to allow us to preview the particular file. So above here, we can say const show the file preview. This is then going to take an individual file, and then inside the body of the function, we're going to then boot up a new instance of a FileReader API, and then essentially inject each image into the DOM. Where we're going to inject it is just underneath our drop zone. So here, we're going to create a div, and I'm just going to call this the list for the moment. And of course, this will mean a list of thumbnails. Now, before we go any further, we can duplicate our document query selector and go and change this over to list. So our list will then give us a reference to the div inside the DOM. We can then start appending those images to it. Now, the way that we can do this is to create first a new instance of the file reader. So we can say const reader equals new file reader. Now this is an object, and it also requires us to create a new instance. You can see here that it lets web applications asynchronously read the contents of files or raw data buffers. And these are things stored on the user's computer using the file or blob objects to specify the file or the data to read. Now we're going to use the file, and we're also going to learn how to grab this through the event that comes back in a moment. Now the key word in that description was the word asynchronously. So before we go any further, let's go and have a look at this reader. Now to prevent any errors, I'm also going to log out. Now to prevent any errors, I'm going to also log out our list so we don't get an error thrown just because of ESLint. And we're also going to pass in the individual file because that's also been unused. So let's go and drag some images in. We can ignore this altogether, but you can see that we have this file reader. So let's expand this. Now this looks a bit more asynchronous in the sense that it has all these events bound to it. We also have a ready state. And if you've been developing for a while, you'll also probably have seen this with something called the XML HTTP request, which is essentially how we make a request to a server. This has then been replaced with a new fetch API. But this file reader essentially gives us lots of different things. You can see that we have done, empty, loading. So we can hook in to different parts of the file depending on what we want to do with it. We might want to load PDF, for example. We might want to load an image. Now this is quite nice because you can see that we have this result, which is at the moment null because we're not doing anything. We have this reader's text, reader's data URL, binary string, array buffer. So depending on what your use case is, you've got lots of different methods available for you. Now what we want to do, instead of console logging the reader, we're going to say reader, and we're going to read the data as a URL. This is then going to give us a nice data URI that we can then set as an image. Now you can see down in here, we have on abort, error, load, load end, load start, progress. There's loads of different things that you can do. You could bind to the progress of these particular events if we wanted to. So to hook into the load event, we're going to say reader add event listener and then pass in load. This thing gives us an event object. So before we go any further, let's have a quick look at what's inside it. So we'll save this out, go and grab an image, drag it in, and you can see that we have these progress events. So this is quite interesting. If we expand this, you can see that we have lots of different details. Now, the thing that we're interested in is this target, because if you remember, the target has a result property, and instead of being null, it now has a data URI bound to it. So you can see this data image. So that is essentially the encoding for my photograph, essentially. So instead of actually referencing the file itself, we've essentially converted it across to a data format. So it doesn't technically exist anywhere apart from in this encoded string of base 64. So if we wanted to then essentially preview this in the browser, we could take our target's result and bind it to our list, which we've already created. So instead of logging our list and our file, we're now going to inject some content into it. So inside our load, we're going to create a nice div. And this is because I want to create a template with some strings. So this is just a nice way that we can do this and set the inner HTML property. Now we're going to use some nice inline strings for this, and then underneath we're going to grab our list and then call append, and then just simply append the div, which means the hard part is essentially out of the way, and all we need to do now is start creating some divs with some information inside. Now it might be that you want to use a proper list node or something like this. I'm just going to use a couple of divs. I'm also going to be a little bit lazy and use some inline styles, which is say display of flex. And inside we're then going to create an image. Now this image source is then going to be the result of what we just seen. So this event.target.result, which we'll bind in a moment. But first, let's finish off our image and then we'll hook it up. So we're going to create an alt tag. We don't really need this because our image has come back. We could set the file's name if we liked. And also we're going to create some inline styles just to make things look a bit prettier. So we'll say the width is going to be 20 pixels. This will make some images look a bit funky, but I'm sure you can take care of adding some further polish in a real world application. So now that we've done the image, what I want to do is start to bind the data for our target.result. So let's save this out and jump in the browser. So when I drag the image in, you can see that we now have a nice little thumbnail. I could drag another image. You can see it goes underneath. I can drag my image again, and it keeps getting appended to the DOM. So while this image is now visible, we could then behind the scenes go and upload them. Now if I inspect element, you can see that this is just a data URI. So this is the base64 encoding for this image. It doesn't actually reference the local file that I have on my machine. Now what's also nice is inside of this load event, because we're in the show file preview function, we also have access to the file itself. So let's save this out. We'll go back to our console, drag the file in, and you can see that we have the thumbnail, but we also have the file with the name and also the size. So we can imagine that our file name probably has something better, but we could say file.name and then bind that as the alt text. But not only this, we could add some further information next to the file itself. So here I'm going to create a p tag. We're going to then say file.name, and then alongside it, we'll just create a nice small span tag, and we can bind the file.size. Now we could create a function, of course, to convert this over to kilobytes, megabytes, and so forth. However, we're going to be quite lazy and just create bytes. So when we drag two images, this is then going to give us the image names as well as the sizes of the images, and also, of course, the thumbnails themselves. Now, as I mentioned, you could add some more polish to this and create some better styling than what I've done, but this essentially allows us to then use the FileReader API to render some nice thumbnails and provide the image name as well as the size of the image. So this is really nice and a nice experience addition to our web application. So we'll leave it there for this lesson. We've looked at this event.target.result. We've passed our file into our read as a data URL. We then bound a load function. We've then used an event listener on our reader. We've created a new div. We've accessed our file object, which we don't need here anymore. We then created some template data, passed in the alt text, set the image source from the data URI, pass some information about the size and the name of our particular image. So this is coming along nicely. There's a few things that we need to also do, and we're going to learn how to pass these images off to a particular server, as well as allowing for a more manual input style where we can actually click to then upload those particular images, which I'm sure you've seen before, where you have something pop down and we can click around and access the files locally and then select a few and then set them that way. So we can provide two different ways. We can drag and drop files in, or we could click a button and then have a window that pops up and allows us to then select the files.